The wind didn't read the press releases. That was the thought, stark and clinical, that cut through the rhythmic beeping of the monitors in Dr. Eris Thorne's mind. Outside the hermetically sealed windows of the Serenity Peaks Community Hospital NICU, the world was on fire. It wasn't a distant, abstract threat on a television screen anymore. It was a malevolent presence, painting the late afternoon sky in grotesque strokes of orange and bruised purple. Ash, the spectral remains of ponderosa pines and hundred-year-old oaks, fell like a soft, gray snow, coating the windowsills and mocking the sterile environment within. The creek fire, as the news anchors called it, had been a problem for the next county over for 3 days. A thing of containment lines, water-dropping helicopters, and sober-faced fire chiefs pointing at maps. Now, the wind had shifted. It had torn the fire from its leash, and the beast was sprinting toward them over the dry, waiting hills. Eris ignored the apocalyptic vista. Her universe had shrunk to the dimensions of a giraffe omnibed, an incubator that looked more like a miniature spacecraft than a crib. Inside, under the warm artificial glow, lay Leo Tanaka. He was a 24-3, born at 24 weeks and 3 days, 4 months before his due date. His skin was translucent, a delicate membrane stretched over a bird-like frame. His eyes fused shut. His lungs, the last major organ to develop, were more theoretical than functional. A ventilator breathed for him, pushing measured puffs of oxygenated air into passages no wider than a coffee stirrer. Eris was performing a delicate recalibration of his endotracheal tube, a procedure requiring microscopic adjustments. Even a millimeter of displacement could damage his fragile airway or render the ventilator useless. Her hands, steady and sure, moved with an economy born of a decade spent in this high-stakes world. Around her, the NICU hummed its usual symphony. The soft whoosh of ventilators, the steady chiming of infusion pumps, the reassuringly regular beep of cardiac monitors. It was a soundscape of controlled crisis, the sound of life clinging on by a thread. "They're saying it's still 2 miles out," whispered Maya, a younger nurse whose wide, terrified eyes kept darting toward the window. "They think the highway will hold it." "The wind doesn't care about highways," Eris murmured, not looking up. Her focus was absolute. She secured the tube with a fresh piece of tape, her movements fluid and practiced. She watched the monitor. Leo's oxygen saturation, which had dipped precariously, climbed back from 87 to a stable 94%. She allowed herself a small internal sigh of relief. He was a fighter. They all were, in this glass garden of impossibly small humans. The hospital's overhead speaker, a sound usually reserved for announcing codes or visiting hours, crackled to life with a jarring burst of static. The voice that followed was tense, trying and failing to sound calm. "Attention, all staff. A Stage 2 evacuation warning has been issued for the Serenity Peaks area. All non-essential personnel, please prepare for an orderly departure. All department heads, report to the main conference room for an emergency briefing. Repeat, department heads to the main conference room." The hum of the NICU didn't change, but the atmosphere did. The carefully constructed calm evaporated, replaced by a thrumming, silent panic. Maya wrung her gloved hands. "Stage 2? Eris, what does that mean for us?" Eris stripped off her gloves and dropped them in the biohazard bin. She looked around the room at the 12 isolates, 12 tiny, fragile lives, each tethered to a small mountain of technology. "It means," she said, her voice low and steady, "that someone better have a damn good plan." The main conference room was a study in controlled chaos. Doctors, nurses, and department heads stood in tight, anxious clusters, their voices a low murmur under the fluorescent lights. At the front of the room stood Dr. Marcus Vance, the hospital's chief administrator. He was a man tailored in expensive charcoal gray, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, projecting an aura of corporate calm that felt grotesquely out of place. He spoke of risk mitigation and operational continuity, as if the approaching wildfire were an inconvenient audit rather than an existential threat. "The county's emergency plan is clear," Vance announced, gesturing to a PowerPoint slide that showed a color-coded map of the hospital. "Critical care units, including the ICU and NICU, are designated for shelter in place. We have the most robust fire suppression systems and structural integrity in these wings." Eris felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She raised her hand. Vance, who was mid-sentence, paused, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Yes, Dr. Thorne?" He used her title, but with a slight emphasis that somehow made it sound dismissive, a concession rather than a sign of respect. "My name is Dr. Thorne, and I am a doctor of nursing practice, specializing in neonatology," she began, her voice even and clear, correcting his implicit slight. "Dr. Vance, the plan you're proposing involves moving the NICU to the West Wing Annex. The HVAC intakes for that wing face directly toward the fire front. We flagged that system for an upgrade last year, but it was denied due to budget constraints. The smoke filtration is inadequate. We would be pumping fine particulates and carbon monoxide directly into the unit. For our patients with their underdeveloped lungs, that's not sheltering. It's poison." The room went quiet. All eyes were on Vance. His calm facade hardened into a mask of professional irritation. "Nurse Thorne," he said, dropping the honorific entirely and letting the word hang in the air, a deliberate power play. "Your concerns, while noted, are speculative. The engineering department assures me the filtration is adequate for these circumstances. The command structure has made a decision based on a holistic view of the crisis. Your job is not to question the plan, but to execute it. Is that clear?" He didn't wait for an answer, turning his attention to the chief of surgery. The message was unmistakable. The nurse had been put back in her box. Eris stood frozen for a moment, the blood rushing in her ears. It was the casual, systemic arrogance she had fought her entire career. The belief that a man with an MBA and a spreadsheet knew more about keeping a premature baby alive than the person who spent 12 hours a day with her hands on that baby's incubator. It was a fight she usually won through stubbornness and data. But today, there was no time. The rage, cold and sharp, solidified into a dreadful certainty in her gut. Vance was going to get her patients killed. A memory, unbidden, surfaced in her mind. A different hospital, 15 years earlier. The sterile smell, the overwhelming grief. She was 19, sitting beside a plastic box, holding the impossibly tiny hand of her brother Daniel. He'd been born at 26 weeks, a surprise fighter who had defied all the odds for 3 precious weeks. Then, a hospital-acquired infection, a thing of protocols and procedures, had swept through the unit. A doctor, a man with the same detached clinical air as Vance, had explained with a placid sort of regret that there was nothing more they could do. It was in that moment, suffocated by the polite, systemic failure of it all, that Eris had made a vow. She would learn the system, master the medicine, and stand in the gap. She would be the one who never said there was nothing more to be done. The memory vanished as quickly as it came, leaving behind a residue of grim resolve. She turned and walked out of the conference room, ignoring the looks from her colleagues. Vance could have his plan. She would make her own. Back in the NICU, the move was already underway. The air was thick with a new kind of tension. Eris saw it immediately. The air quality monitor near the entrance to the new annex was already flashing yellow. A low, insistent alarm began to beep from the far corner of the room. Baby Isabella, a 28-weeker with chronic lung disease, was desatting. Her oxygen saturation was plummeting. "Her sats are dropping to 82, Maya cried out, her voice trembling. Eris didn't hesitate. She bypassed the main ventilation system on Isabella's isolette, a direct violation of a dozen hospital protocols. She grabbed a portable HEPA filter unitone she had personally requisitioned for viral containment and kept squirreled away for just such an emergency, and jury rigged its output hose directly to the isolette's air intake. "You can't do that!" exclaimed a senior nurse, Carol, a stickler for rules. "That's an unapproved equipment modification. You'll be written up." "Write me up," Eris snapped, her eyes locked on Isabella's monitor. The numbers began to creep upward. 84, 87, 91. Or, "You can help me keep these kids breathing." Carol stared, mouth agape, then wordlessly turned to help another nurse. The first small rebellion had begun. Then came the boom. It was a deep, concussive whump that vibrated through the floor, followed by the sickening groan of failing machinery. The lights flickered violently, then died, plunging the windowless annex into absolute, terrifying darkness. The reassuring symphony of beeps and whooshes ceased, replaced by a sudden, deafening silence. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Then the emergency lights flickered on, casting long, eerie shadows. The hospital's main backup generator had kicked in. But a second later, a high-pitched whine emanated from a utility closet down the hall, the sound of a secondary system under catastrophic strain. It sputtered, coughed, and died. Every piece of life-sustaining equipment in the NICU ventilators, the monitors, the infusion pumps, the heaters in the isoletswas, now running on its own internal battery. A series of new, frantic alarms began to shriek, each one a tiny countdown to disaster. On the side of each ventilator, a small LCD screen displayed the grim reality. Battery life remaining, 58 minutes. They were on an island, and the tide was coming in. Eris grabbed an emergency satellite phone from the crash cart and punched in Vance's extension. The connection was poor, full of static. "Vance!" she yelled over the din of the alarms. "It's Thorn! The backup generator for the West Wing is down! We have no power! We are on battery only!" Vance's voice was a tinny, distant squawk. "Unforeseen complication? Engineers are working on it. We don't have time for that," Eris shouted, her voice raw with desperation. "We have less than an hour of battery life. The air is already toxic. You have to let us evacuate. I need the transport ambulance. Now!" There was a pause, filled with the crackle of the failing signal and the sound of the wind howling outside. Then Vance's voice returned, colder and harder than before. "Negative, Thorn. The fire has jumped Highway 49. Sheriff Brody has the roads completely locked down. I am officially declaring a shelter, in place for all remaining personnel. That is a direct order. It is the only viable option." Eris felt the blood drain from her face. "Viable option? Dr. Vance, that is not an option. It's a death sentence. We have 12 infants here who will die when these batteries run out." "Do not violate a direct order, Thorn. The potential for liability is." The line went dead. Silence. Aris stood holding the useless phone, the deadness of the connection mirroring the dead end of their situation. He had done it. From the safety of his command post, Marcus Vance had just condemned them all to death to avoid a lawsuit. She looked around the chaotic room, at the pale, frightened faces of her team, at the frantic, blinking lights on the equipment. She saw Maya trying to manually bag a baby whose ventilator had already failed, her hands shaking. And in that moment, something inside Eris snapped. The years of quiet frustration, of fighting for every budget line, of swallowing condescension, of watching bureaucrats play God with other people's children, it all coalesced into a single, diamond-hard point of clarity. She saw her brother's face again, not in memory, but in the face of every infant in that room. "Forget him," she said, her voice cutting through the panic. It wasn't loud, but it had the density of a black hole, drawing every eye in the room. "Forget the order. We're getting out." The plan was insane, born of desperation and fueled by adrenaline. Eris laid it out in short, clipped sentences, the calm in her voice, a stark contrast to the madness of her words. "The main transport ambulance is gone, but the old one is still in the maintenance garage. Bessie." David, a broad-shouldered nurse who had served 2 tours as an army medic in Afghanistan, nodded slowly. "The decommissioned one? From the 90s? Does it even run?" "It has to," Eris said simply. "David, you're with me. Maya, you and Carol start prepping the kids for transport. We're going manual. Grab every portable oxygen tank, every ambu bag. We'll wrap them in thermal blankets. 1 nurse per baby. You breathe for them. You are their machine now." The team, which had been adrift in panic, suddenly had a purpose. A spark of Eris's defiant energy ignited them. They moved with newfound speed and precision. Eris and David sprinted down the smoky corridors to the maintenance garage at the back of the hospital. The door was locked. David didn't waste a second. He braced himself and slammed his shoulder into the door. Once, twice. On the 3rd try, the frame splintered and the door flew open. There she was, old Bessie. A boxy, faded Ford ambulance, coated in a thick layer of dust, its tires looking perilously soft. A relic. The keys, predictably, were not in the ignition. "No time to search," David grunted, already prying the plastic casing off the steering column. "You know how to boost one of these?" "I grew up in the country," Eris said, already scanning the garage. "I know how to do a lot of things." She began to frantically search the shelves, her mind a running checklist. She found a stash of road flares, a heavy-duty flashlight, and a fire extinguisher. She grabbed them all. Behind her, David twisted 2 wires together. The engine sputtered, coughed a plume of black smoke, then turned over with a protesting roar that sounded like the most beautiful music Eris had ever heard. They threw open the back doors. The interior smelled of dust and mildew. Eris directed David to pull the ambulance around to the NICU's side exit, a rarely used door that led to a small service road. Back in the annex, The scene was one of organized chaos. The nurses worked in a silent, frantic ballet, swaddling the infants, attaching them to portable oxygen tanks, and preparing the manual resuscitation bags. Each baby was a fragile, precious package. Eris returned just as Maya was carefully lifting Leo Tanaka from his isolette. His monitor, its battery now critical, let out a final, dying beep and went dark. "Okay," Eris said, her voice commanding the room. "It's time, one at a time, fast and smooth." They formed a human chain, passing the infants carefully into the back of the roaring ambulance. Eris took the driver's seat, the old vinyl cracked and cold beneath her. David rode shotgun, a flashlight in his hand. In the back, Maya, Carol, and two other nurses huddled together, each one focused on their tiny charge, their hands rhythmically squeezing the life-giving bags. Squeeze, release. Squeeze, release. The only sound in the universe. Eris put the ambulance in gear. The transmission groaned in protest. She gunned the engine and pulled away from the building, leaving the dead west wing behind. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The world outside the windshield was a surreal nightmare. The air was a thick, orange-brown soup, shot through with glowing red embers that swirled in the wind like malevolent fireflies. The service road was barely visible. She navigated by memory, her heart pounding against her ribs. They rounded the corner of the hospital and saw the main exit road. It was blocked. Two county sheriff's cruisers were parked diagonally across the pavement, their red and blue lights flashing frantically, cutting through the smoke. Standing between them, his face grim and illuminated by the strobing lights, was Sheriff Brody. Sheriff Brody held a megaphone to his lips, his voice booming over the roar of the wind and the engine. "Turn this vehicle around! This is a mandatory lockdown zone! I repeat, turn around now!" Eris slowed the ambulance to a crawl, stopping 20 feet from the blockade. She rolled down her window, and the acrid smell of burnt pine and plastic filled the cab, stinging her eyes. "Sheriff," she yelled, her voice hoarse. "Sheriff Brody, it's Dr. Thorne from the hospital." Brody lowered the megaphone, squinting. He was a big man, his face etched with exhaustion and stress. "Thorne? What in God's name are you doing?" "I gave explicit orders. No one in, no one out." "The backup power failed in the NICU," Eris shouted, the words tumbling out. "The building is full of smoke. I have 12 critical care infants in here. Their ventilators are dead. We're keeping them alive by hand. They have minutes, Sheriff. We won't survive if we stay. We're going to Mercy General." Brody's face was a mask of conflict. He was a man of rules, of order. In a crisis, the chain of command was all that stood between civilization and chaos. But he was also a man who had seen too much tragedy in his 20 years of service. He looked past Eris, into the dark interior of the ambulance, and could just make out the huddled shapes of the nurses, their arms moving in that steady, life-sustaining rhythm. "I can't let you through, Doctor," he said, his voice strained. "My orders from the emergency command from your own hospital administrator are absolute. The fire is unpredictable. The roads aren't safe." "Then you'll have to shoot me," Eris said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying with absolute finality. She looked him directly in the eye, a silent plea and a defiant challenge all in one. "Because I'm not letting these babies die in there." She didn't wait for his response. She took a deep breath, shifted the groaning transmission into first gear, and eased her foot onto the accelerator. The ambulance lurched forward. "Ma'am, stop your vehicle!" one of the younger deputies yelled, his hand instinctively going to the holster of his sidearm. Eris kept her eyes locked on Brody's. The ambulance moved slowly, deliberately, aiming for the narrow gap between the two cruisers. It was a game of chicken she couldn't afford to lose. Metal screamed as the side of the ambulance scraped against the fender of one cruiser, then the other. For a heart-stopping second, she thought they were stuck. She gunned the engine. The old Vate roared, and with a final, jarring screech, old Bessie broke through. "Hold your fire!" Brody roared at his deputies, who had their weapons half-drawn. "Stand down! Let her go!" He stood in the road, watching the taillights of the battered ambulance disappear into the swirling smoke. He knew he would face a reckoning for this. He had defied a direct order. But as the smell of burning diesel faded, he realized he couldn't have lived with himself if he'd done anything else. The drive was a descent into hell. Eris gripped the wheel, her entire being focused on the few feet of road visible in the headlights. Embers, some as large as her fist, rained down on the windshield, sizzling and cracking on the glass. A flaming branch crashed onto the road in front of them, and she swerved violently, the old ambulance fishtailing on the asphalt. In the back, the nurses held on, never breaking the rhythm. Squeeze, release. Squeeze, release. The main highway was an impassable wall of flames. But Eris knew these hills. As a teenager, she'd explored every dirt track and fire road on her beat-up mountain bike. She wrenched the wheel, turning onto a narrow, unpaved logging road she hadn't been on in 20 years. The ambulance bucked and jolted over the rough terrain. Branches scraped and screeched against the sides. Twice, David had to lean out the window to push away burning limbs that threatened to block their path. It felt like an eternity. The smoke was so thick she could barely breathe, her lungs on fire. Then, just as she felt her resolve starting to fray, they broke through. They crested a small hill, and the dense smoke thinned. Below them, nestled in the next valley, was a sight more beautiful than any sunrise: the clear, steady electric lights of the town of North Haven. And in its center, the glowing beacon of Mercy General Hospital. A wave of uncontrollable sobs shook Eris's body. She choked them back, her hands still locked on the wheel. Not yet. Almost there. She pulled up to the emergency bay of Mercy General, the ambulance sputtering as if giving its last ounce of strength. Before she could even put it in park, the bay doors flew open. Staff swarmed the vehicle. A nurse Eris had never seen before made eye contact with her through the windshield and gave her a sharp, determined nod. Maya had gotten a text through. They were expected. Doctors, nurses, and respiratory therapists descended on the back of the ambulance, a whirlwind of calm, professional efficiency. "We've got you," a doctor said, his voice a balm on Eris's raw nerves. "Let's get them inside. We have the NICU team on standby." The infants, one by one, were carefully passed into waiting hands and whisked inside. The transfer was seamless, a miracle of coordination. Eris watched them go, her body humming with a level of adrenaline she'd never known. Only when the last baby was safely inside, when Maya and Carol and the other nurses had followed them through the doors, did she finally allow herself to stop. She cut the engine. The sudden silence was profound. She leaned her forehead against the steering wheel, the cracked plastic cool against her feverish skin. The shaking started in her hands and spread through her entire body, a violent, uncontrollable tremor. She was smoke-stained, sweat-soaked, and utterly, completely spent. But they were safe. She had done it. They were safe. The next morning, there was no medal. There was no press conference hailing her as a hero. There was only a borrowed, windowless office at Mercy General, the air stale with the smell of old coffee. Across a cheap laminate desk sat two people who held her entire future in their hands. A stone-faced vice president from Serenity Peak's parent corporation, and a woman from the state nursing board with eyes that offered no hint of sympathy. They didn't see a savior. They saw a liability. The words they used were a legal minefield, each one a carefully placed explosive. Gross insubordination. Theft of hospital property. Reckless endangerment. Willful violation of established emergency protocols. Eris tried to explain. She spoke of the failed generator, the toxic air, the dying batteries, the countdown clock on 12 innocent lives. They listened with polite, impenetrable patience. "Dr. Thorne," the corporate VP said, his voice smooth as polished granite, "your subjective experience has been noted. However, the fact remains that you defied a direct order from the designated incident commander. You absconded with hospital assets and transported critically ill patients across an active fire line against the explicit instructions of law enforcement. The potential for a catastrophic outcome was immense." "The catastrophic outcome was staying," Eris countered, her voice trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and fury. The woman from the nursing board slid a folder across the desk. "Pending a full and thorough investigation into these events," she said, her tone flat, "your license to practice nursing in the state of California is hereby suspended. You are not to engage in any clinical activity or patient contact until this matter is resolved." The words hit Eris with the force of a physical blow. Her license. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was her identity. It was the culmination of the vow she'd made at her brother's side. It was everything. She returned to her small, silent apartment in a daze. The air still smelled faintly of smoke. She turned on the television. The lead story was the Creek Fire, now largely contained. The camera panned across the front of Serenity Peak's community hospital, scorched and soot-stained, but still standing. And there, in front of it, was Dr. Marcus Vance, looking somber and authoritative for the cameras. "We were fortunate that our robust shelter, in-place protocols ensured the safety of the facility," Vance said, his voice oozing practiced sincerity. There was, however, an unfortunate incident involving a rogue nurse who, in a state of apparent panic, initiated an unsanctioned and needlessly dangerous evacuation of the NICU. While her intentions may have been good, her actions defied expert command and placed patients and staff at extreme risk. "We are conducting a full review to understand this serious lapse in judgment." Eris stared at the screen, her blood turning to ice. He was twisting it. He was erasing the truth, painting her as a hysterical woman who had panicked while he had been the calm, steady hand. The audience's rage, had they known the truth, would have been immense. But they didn't know. They only saw the man in the suit, the official source, and heard the story he was weaving. Eris felt a profound and terrifying powerlessness. He was stealing her heroism and branding it as a crime. The days that followed were a gray, featureless blur. Her phone rang constantly with calls from hospital lawyers, board investigators, and union representatives who spoke in cautious, non-committal tones. She was an outcast, a pariah. The career she had poured her entire soul into was not just over. It was being systematically dismantled and rewritten as a cautionary tale. She sat on her couch, the silence of the apartment a crushing weight. The self-doubt, a poison more potent than any accusation, began to seep in. Did she panic? Was Vance right? Was there another way? Could the power have been restored in time? The questions gnawed at her, eroding the diamond-hard certainty she'd felt in the heat of the moment. This was her lowest point, alone in the quiet aftermath, with nothing but the ghost of her career for company. The truth, however, had a constituency of its own. It resided in the hearts of 12 grateful families. While Eris was isolated in her apartment, the parents of the Serenity 12, as they had begun to call themselves, were connecting. A private Facebook group, started by Leo Tanaka's mother, Chloe, became a hub of information and support. They shared pictures of their recovering infants, now stable in the Mercy General NICU, and they started to compare notes. Chloe, an astrophysicist at Berkeley with a researcher's instinct, wasn't buying Vance's story for a second. She gently pressed a traumatized but grateful Maya for details. Maya, terrified of losing her job, finally poured out the whole story: the smoke in the annex, the failed generator, the dying batteries, and Vance's chilling final order over the sat phone. Another parent, a lawyer, managed to get an off-the-record conversation with Sheriff Brody. Brody, burdened by his conscience, was cagey but admitted, "It was a messy situation. Dr. Thorne made a call I couldn't have authorized, but looking back, I think she probably saved them all." The pieces were coming together. The story found its champion in Ben Carter, a young, hungry investigative journalist for a Bay Area online news publication. He'd been covering the fire but felt the official narrative was too clean. An anonymous tip led him to the parents' group. He spent days working his sources, corroborating Maya's story with maintenance logs that showed the repeated, denied requests for an HVAC upgrade. He found an engineer who confirmed the secondary generator for the West Wing had been offline for a week, awaiting a part. He pieced together a timeline that was not just damning, but terrifying. His article, published a week after the fire, was a bombshell. It was titled, "The Angel of Serenity Peaks, or a Rogue Nurse: The 45 Minutes That Decided 12 Lives." It laid out the facts in stark, undeniable detail. It didn't paint Eris as a saint, but as a highly competent professional forced into an impossible choice by systemic failure and bureaucratic cowardice. It included anonymous but powerful quotes from nurses on her team and a devastating analysis of Vance's shelter-in-place order, which Carter's expert sources called tantamount to a death warrant. The story exploded. It was shared thousands, then hundreds of thousands of times. The narrative, so carefully controlled by Vance, was ripped to shreds. Team Thorne and Justice for Nurse Thorne began trending on social media. The public, now armed with the truth, was furious. The rage that Eris had felt alone in her apartment became a collective roar. Local and then national news outlets picked up Carter's story. A GoFundMe started by the parents to cover Eris's legal fees shattered its goal in hours. Dr. Vance, who had been basking in his role as the stoic leader, was suddenly facing a public relations nightmare. He held a press conference to try and quell the storm, but the reporters, armed with Carter's facts, hammered him with questions he couldn't answer. Dr. Vance, can you confirm the backup generator was non-operational? Dr. Vance, did you or did you not order Dr. Thorne to let those babies die? He stammered. He deflected. He looked like a man caught in a lie, and the court of public opinion delivered its verdict. The villain of the story had been unmasked. Eris watched the tide turn from the surreal detachment of her apartment. It was validating, but it didn't feel real. Her suspension was still in place. Her fight was far from over. One afternoon, there was a knock on her door. Expecting another process server, or perhaps Ben Carter looking for a follow-up, she opened it wearily. Standing in the hallway of her modest apartment building were a man and a woman who looked utterly out of place. They wore dark, impeccably tailored suits that spoke of government authority, not corporate law. The man, who was of Japanese descent with a calm, dignified air and intelligent eyes, spoke first. Dr. Thorne, my name is Kenji Tanaka. This is my associate, Miss Albright. I am the Director of Human Spaceflight Operations for NASA. May we have a moment of your time? The words were so unexpected, so completely alien to her current reality, that Eris could only stare. NASA? It had to be a mistake. A very strange, elaborate prank. I think you have the wrong person, she stammered. Are you the Dr. Eris Thorne who formerly worked at Serenity Peaks Community Hospital? Tanaka asked, his expression unwavering. Yes, but then we have the right person. She let them in, her mind reeling. They sat on her inexpensive couch, looking as out of place as astronauts in a submarine. Eris perched on the edge of a chair, her heart hammering. Dr. Tanaka got straight to the point. My daughter is Chloe Tanaka, an astrophysicist at Berkeley. Her son, my grandson, Leo, was born at 24 weeks. He was one of the infants in your NICU on the night of the fire. He pulled out his phone and showed her a picture. It was a recent one. Leo was still tiny, still in an incubator at Mercy General, but he was stable, his eyes now open, looking at the camera with a drowsy curiosity. You saved his life, Tanaka said, his voice thick with an emotion that cut through his formal demeanor. My family, and 11 others, owe you a debt that can never be repaid. Eris was speechless, tears welling in her eyes. I was just doing my job. No, Tanaka said, his voice shifting from personal gratitude to something else, something analytical and sharp. That's where you're wrong, and that is why we are here. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. We at NASA followed Mr. Carter's reporting very closely. Then we conducted our own due diligence. We have reviewed the maintenance logs from your hospital. We have read the technical specifications of Old Bessie. We have spoken, through back channels, to Sheriff Brody, to members of your nursing team, and even to the mechanic who services that decommissioned ambulance. We have analyzed your actions not as a matter of hospital protocol, but as a mission-critical problem-solving exercise. He sounded like he was debriefing a flight commander. Dr. Thorne, he continued, what you demonstrated that night was a rare and extraordinary confluence of qualities. First, elite medical expertise under extreme biological and environmental duress. Second, the ability to innovate and jury-rig viable solutions with severely limited resources, your ad hoc HEPA filter, your decision to hotwire a derelict vehicle. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the psychological fortitude to make a swift, data-driven command decision that ran contrary to established protocol, because your analysis indicated that protocol would lead to total mission failure. And fourth, a willingness to assume immense personal and professional risk for the sake of the primary objective in this case, the preservation of life. He paused, letting the words sink in. We spend millions of dollars and thousands of hours creating high-fidelity simulations to try and identify these exact qualities in our astronaut candidates. We put them in centrifuges, we sink them in pools, we break their equipment, all to see how they react. You didn't need a simulation, you lived it. He reached into his briefcase and retrieved a thick, official-looking folder with the iconic NASA meatball logo on it. He slid it across the coffee table. Dr. Eris Thorne, Kenji Tanaka said, his voice now imbued with the full weight of his authority. The Astronaut Selection Board has reviewed your case. They have authorized me to formally invite you to apply for the next astronaut candidate class. He held up a hand before she could speak. Frankly, Doctor, you should consider this less an application and more a direct recruitment. We know what you're made of. The seat, if you want it and can pass the physical, is yours. Aris stared at the folder, then at Tanaka's earnest face, then back at the folder. The world tilted on its axis. Just yesterday, she was a disgraced nurse fighting for her career. Today, the dream she had buried 15 years ago, the dream of the stars she had shared with her father, had just walked through her door and offered her the moon. The whiplash was so profound, so utterly unbelievable, that all she could do was sit there in stunned, absolute silence. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. The story of NASA's offer was the final, decisive blow against Dr. Vance and the hospital's administration. It was the ultimate validation. A public inquiry led to Vance's forced resignation and disgrace, and the parent company settled a massive lawsuit filed collectively by the 12 families. The state nursing board, facing immense public pressure and a direct inquiry from a U.S. senator whose committee oversaw NASA's budget, expedited Aris's investigation. Her license was reinstated with a formal commendation for extraordinary judgment and heroism under duress. Sheriff Brody received a quiet, internal reprimand for the broken roadblock, but was publicly praised by the county for his discretion in a complex humanitarian crisis. The catharsis for the audience, and for Aris, was complete. 6 months later, Aris stood sweating in the humid Houston air, looking at the iconic buildings of the Johnson Space Center. She had passed the grueling physicals and psychological evaluations. She was no longer Dr. Thorne, the suspended nurse. She was astronaut candidate Thorne. But her trials were not over. They had merely changed form. The rage-inducing bureaucracy was gone, replaced by a new set of antagonists, the crucible of the program itself, and the professional friction that came with it. Her cohort was a collection of the best and brightest: test pilots with thousands of hours in supersonic jets, engineers with doctorates from MIT, geologists who had mapped volcanic caves. And then there was Aris, the nurse. Commander Jack Viper Riley, a cocky, handsome former Navy pilot with an ego the size of a shuttle booster, made his opinion clear early on. "No offense, Doc," he'd said to her in the chow hall, "but I'm used to my crew having flight hours, not clinical hours. Hope you don't get queasy." Dr. Evelyn Reed, a brilliant astrophysicist with a razor-sharp intellect and zero patience for anything outside her field, was more subtly dismissive. She constantly questioned Aris's DNP, the Doctor of Nursing Practice degree, clearly viewing it as a softer science than her own hard-won PhD. These weren't villains like Vance. They were competitors, professionals at the top of their game, testing her, sizing her up, forcing her to prove she belonged in their elite tribe. The fight wasn't against a broken system anymore. It was for her own place at the table. The training was designed to break them. In the KC-135, the Vomit Comet, they experienced gut-wrenching cycles of weightlessness and hypergravity. Viper, true to his call sign, handled it with ease. Aris, relying on her deep understanding of human physiology and a sheer force of will, managed to avoid getting sick, focusing on the complex medical procedures she was tasked with performing while floating. In the Neutral Buoyancy Laboratory, a massive pool containing a full-scale mock-up of the International Space Station, they practiced EVAs, or spacewalks. The bulky suits were claustrophobic and exhausting. During one simulation, a critical valve on Viper's suit was designed to fail. He struggled with the complex, multi-step engineering checklist to fix it, his movements growing frantic. Aris, monitoring his vitals from the simulated airlock, calmly talked him through it, her voice a steady presence in his helmet. She noticed a slight tremor in his hand on her monitor before he did, and advised him to anchor himself before he lost his grip. He fixed the valve. That evening in the chow hall, he sat at her table. "Nice call today, Doc," he said. It was a small victory, but it was a start. She earned Evelyn Reed's respect in the classroom. During a seminar on closed-loop life support systems, the discussion turned to filtering CO2 and managing fluid dynamics in microgravity. Aris, drawing on her deep, practical knowledge of neonatal ventilators and dialysis machinists essentially miniature, highly complex life support system, offered a novel perspective on managing gas exchange and preventing biofilm contamination. She explained it not with complex physics equations, but with the grounded reality of keeping a 1-pound human alive. Evelyn, who had been thinking of the problem purely in theoretical terms, looked at Aris with a new, grudging admiration. "That's a remarkably elegant analogy," she conceded. Aris was proving that the same skills that made her a great NICU nurse, unflappable calm, a deep understanding of physiology, and the ability to problem-solve when technology fails were the exact skills needed to keep a human alive in the most hostile environment imaginable. 2 years flew by in a blur of training, simulations, and study. Eris had not just survived the astronaut candidate program, she had excelled. She had become an integral part of her cohort, the quiet, steady center they all orbited. The day of mission assignments arrived. The candidates sat in an auditorium, their blue flight suits immaculate, the nervous energy in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. The NASA administrator called out the assignments for the next series of Artemis missions, the program designed to return humanity to the moon. For Artemis 4, the mission specialist and flight surgeon will be Dr. Eris Thorne. A wave of applause filled the room. Viper slapped her on the back. Evelyn gave her a genuine, wide smile. Eris felt a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Pure, unadulterated joy. At the press conference that followed, she stood on stage with her crew, blinking in the flash of the cameras. In the front row, she spotted a familiar face. Ben Carter, the journalist who had broken her story. He had a prime spot, a senior correspondent for a national network now. He got the last question. "Dr. Thorne," he called out, his voice professional but with a hint of their shared history in it. "You've had a remarkable journey, one that started on a truly terrifying night at Serenity Peaks. Looking back on that night now, what do you think?" Eris paused, the question taking her back through the fire, the fear, the despair, and the impossible turn of fate. She looked into the camera, her gaze steady, and gave the answer that had become her truth. "That night, my mission was to save 12 very small lives in a single room," she said, her voice clear and resonant. "On Artemis 4, my crew's mission is to conduct science and expand our foothold in space, for the benefit of all 8 billion lives on the planet below. As it turns out, the scale changes, but the job is exactly the same. You take care of your crew, you solve the problems in front of you, and you do whatever it takes to get everyone home safe." A year later, the job was real. The final scene is one of quiet awe. Eris is weightless, floating in the cabin of the Orion spacecraft. The roar of launch is a distant memory, replaced by the gentle, life-sustaining hum of the ship's electronics and the calm, tinny voice of mission control in her earpiece. Below her, through the viewport, hangs the Earth. It is a sight of impossible beauty, a vibrant, swirling marble of blue, white, and green, suspended in the velvet absolute blackness of space. It's breathtaking. It's perfect. She sees the curve of the planet, the thin, fragile wisp of the atmosphere that separates all of known life from the void. Her crewmates are busy, running checklists, but Eris allows herself this one moment. Her gaze drifts across the planet as it slowly rotates. She sees the night side of North America approaching, a vast, dark continent that will soon glitter with the spiderweb of city lights. Her eyes trace the coastline of California. Down there, under that blanket of darkness and light, is everything. Serenity Peaks, Mercy General, the Johnson Space Center. She thinks of the NICU, the frantic beeping of the failing monitors, now a ghost in her memory. She thinks of Leo Tanaka, now a thriving, healthy little boy who would see pictures of this mission in school and know that the lady in the spaceship was the one his mother told him about, the lady who saved him. The journey that began with her father's telescope and was forged in the heart of a wildfire had brought her here to this impossible vantage point. She had fought a broken system to save a small world contained in a dozen plastic boxes. In return, the universe had opened its arms to her. She presses her hand against the cold glass of the viewport, a silent thank you to her father, to her brother Daniel, to every life she had ever touched. The nurse who had dedicated her life to watching over the smallest and most fragile of us was now, quite literally, watching over us all. The scale had changed, but the mission was the same. And it was just beginning.